Welcome. Welcome to the Carl Sagan discussion series. My name is Dennis Ojima. I'm a senior research scientist at Colorado State University. This is first of a series of discussion series that we'll have, and it's organized to really explore in greater depth the development of a scientific career of an exceptional individual selected to give the Carl Sagan Lecture at the fall annual meeting for the American Geophysical Union. This year's selected speaker by AGU's Biogeosciences section is Dr. Compton J. Tucker III. During our series, we will host a set of conversations with experts who have collaborated with Dr. Tucker on various topics related to remote sensing of the Earth biosphere, explorations of the carbon cycle, documenting loss of biodiversity, and development of discourse within the global environmental governance of our planet. These are areas where Dr. Tucker has made significant contributions. And we'll post later the series of dates where these experts will be invited to speak about the advances that he has made. Let me add that today's conversation and presentation will be recorded, so we can share this with other colleagues over time, and those who have want to see this again can do so. As a brief introduction to Compton Tucker's career, he's a senior research scientist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, where he's been employed since 1975. He received his bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD here at Colorado State University. He has broad experience in remote sensing, research, and applications, and has been awarded a number of prestigious sets of recognitions, both nationally and internationally. His research interests have focused on Earth system research through the use of satellite remote sensing, but it has extended beyond just the what we view as remote sensing of the Earth system to actually looking at things in the past as well. And from 2002 to 2012, he's joined the NASA Space Archaeological Program, where he led a group of archaeologists to map sites with ground penetrating radar and magnetometry in Turkey. Thank you. And sites in Turkey and Troy, at Gordian, and other places in the Middle East. He's authored over 190 journal articles and has been cited extensively. He's a fellow within AGU in Biogeosciences. He was elected in 2009, fellow of the American Association of Advanced Sciences, has been received awards, including the Galathea Medal, the Royal Danish Geography Society Medal, the Vega Medal from the Swedish Society of Anthropology and Geography, and has received the Senior Executive Service Presidential Rank Award for Meritorious Service in 2017. So we were very fortunate to have Compton Tucker nominated and selected to be the second speaker, and he's volunteered to provide insights today on the impact that Carl Sagan had to planetary science and research and defining the fragility of planet Earth. He will also then also provide perspectives of his own view of life on Earth and the universe. So with that, I'll turn this the discussion over to Compton Tucker.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and it's an honor to be here. Carl Sagan was a visionary, a scientist, and an excellent communicator, a communicator extraordinaire. He was closely associated with NASA, and believe it or not, in 1975, I wrote Carl Sagan a letter when I was about to finish my PhD at Colorado State University, inquiring if there were any postdoctoral fellowships in exobiology. And so this is his reply to me. I mailed the letter on the 2nd or 3rd of in early January. He responded within 2 weeks. Thank you for your recent letter. I wish there were some positive response I could give you, not only at Cornell, but at all. There are only a few of them, institutions, engaged in exobiology. I know of no opportunities of the sort you seek. As soon as we find life somewhere else, I will be sure to write you back. With all good wishes, cordially, Carl Sagan. So that was very encouraging. I'd read several of his books and got very interested in planetary habitability, why life exists on Earth and not elsewhere, and also the fragility and uniqueness of the Earth. And I think Carl's letter back to me showed he was always happy to engage with the public, with students, anyone who was interested, he would spend time with. That's a very good example for us all. So one of the amazing things about Carl Sagan is he was associated with about 10 different NASA space science missions. There's a summary of them here, from Mariner 2 to Venus in 1962, Mariner 9, Pioneer 10, Pioneer 11, Vikings 1 and 2, Voyagers 1 and 2, and Galileo to Jupiter in 1989. And today I'll be dwelling upon Voyager 1, because Voyager 1 took an iconic photograph of the Earth, which Carl Sagan then described very aptly as the pale blue dot. If you haven't heard his recording of this, I will play it at the end of the presentation. But for all of us who study the Earth, this is something which is inspiring and poetic. One of the questions people ask is, well, why is NASA looking at the Earth? And I respond and say, NASA looks up, looks down, and is looking forward, because NASA was founded to use space to improve the knowledge of the Earth and also the universe, and that's what NASA does. Some people are very surprised that NASA spends about half of its science budget, just under half, studying the Earth with Earth viewing satellites, which study all the aspects of the Earth system, the oceans, the land, the atmosphere, and how they interact. So anytime the question is asked, I say in NASA, we're looking up, looking down, and especially looking forward. Now let's talk about Voyager 1, which Carl Sagan was closely associated with. That was launched on the 5th of September, 1977, and this was a mission to the outer solar system. So the Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and then it left the solar system. And in the lower right, in the lower left-hand corner is a blow-up, or is a photograph of the actual spacecraft, of the Voyager 1 spacecraft. On the right-hand side, you can see the launch, and then above it, you can see where Voyager 1 traveled from the 5th of September 1977 until the 15th or 16th of February of 1990, when contact was lost with the Voyager 1 spacecraft. And you had several close encounters of Voyager 1 with different entities in the solar system, different planets. Let's look at some of those. So in this figure, we're looking in the upper panel of all of the planets which Voyager 1 imaged: Jupiter, Earth, Venus, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And on Valentine's Day of 1990, Voyager 1, at Carl Sagan's direction, got the imaging team to turn the imager to look back at Earth. And that resulted in the next image I'll show, which is the pale blue dot. But in the lower left-hand corner of the image that's up now, there is an image of Voyager 2 as it observed our solar system. And on the lower right-hand portion of the image, you see for Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 what their trajectories were with respect to our solar system. They imaged many of the larger planets. The mission was to the outer planets of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And then Voyager 1, on the 14th of February, then turned its imager to look back at Earth, and this image resulted, which is the pale blue dot. Now, this may look unremarkable to some people, but that's the Earth. Carl Sagan summed it up in 6 words. That's here, that's home, that's us. So this is what the Earth looks like when imaged from 6 billion kilometers away, slightly past the orbit of Neptune, looking back at the Earth. And this has inspired people to focus upon all of our similarities and to minimize our differences. This is extremely important. This is represented by all of the people in this image. We're all in this together. The Earth is a very finite place. It's the only planet we know where life exists. In addition to Homo sapiens, we have a phenomenal biological diversity, which we need to conserve. Here are 2 charismatic giraffes. Here's a small group of elephants. Here are some whales. Here is a sea turtle and some fish in a coral reef. These are all examples of an amazing biological diversity associated with the only planet that we know of which has life. This is a reason to be conservative with the Earth, to protect it, and to treasure it. Next, I'll show an image which my late friend Pierce Sellers took from the space shuttle looking towards the edge of the Earth when he was in orbit on one of his space shuttle missions. And what you see is a sunrise. The sun is just starting to come above the horizon, and that long blue limb of light you see, that is the Earth's atmosphere. This is called the atmospheric limb. And what you see from space at this great distance before sunrise is the thinness of the Earth's atmosphere. It's a very, very thin atmosphere which envelops the Earth, but it is extremely important. And the reason for its importance is in the next slide. This is something which is very simple to do. Anyone who's interested, I'll be happy to send you the spreadsheet which has all of this information in it. Atmospheric composition is really important. You can take the energy output of the sun in watts per meter squared at the photosphere of the sun. You can propagate that to Venus, to Earth, and to Mars. We know from astronomical measurements what the albedo, or the reflected light, is, electromagnetic radiation from these 3 planets. The complement to that is what is absorbed. You then can know what the absorbing area is because we know the diameters of all of these 3 planets. And then you can calculate how much energy is absorbed from the sun. From that, you can use Planck's function, and you can calculate what the temperature of those planets should be without an atmosphere. And when you do that, what you find for Venus is the temperature should be 64 degrees Fahrenheit. For Earth, it should be about 0 or 1 degree Fahrenheit, and for Mars, about minus 89 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we know from space science measurements of the temperature of Venus, from our measurements of the temperature of Earth, and from our space science measurements of Mars, the actual temperatures on Venus are on the order of 800 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit. The Earth mean temperature is about 16 degrees centigrade or 61 degrees Fahrenheit. And on Mars, the temperature is very similar to what you would expect without an atmosphere, about minus 80 or 81 degrees Fahrenheit. So this figure shows the importance of an atmosphere. Our atmosphere is insulating. It makes the Earth habitable. In the case of Venus, as Carl Sagan pointed out, after working on some data from Venus and the atmosphere of Venus, Venus is a runaway greenhouse effect. So at this point, let's talk some about the Earth. And it's important that we take a scientific approach, which this quotation from Confucius sums up very well. Without proper definitions, logical discourse is impossible. Without logical discourse, nothing can be accomplished. And we know in science, we define things, we use measurements, we are able to study the Earth, space, many things in our universe, but it requires the use of definitions, of measurements, and this enables the science that we do in earth science and space science. Now, speaking of earth science, I put Carl Sagan up with the pillars of people who have contributed in a very major way to earth science because of his contributions to letting us see the insignificance of the Earth in a planetary sense. And we realize that we're in this alone. There's no place we can go. Earth has to be treasured and has to be conserved. Now, in this figure on the far right-hand side is Albert Wegener, who proposed continental drift and was ridiculed for many years until Admiral Harry Hess, who was also a professor of physical oceanography in the Navy. He is in the lower middle in his Navy uniform from World War II. He was in charge of a ship that had a sonar on it. And wherever he went in his naval duties, he had the sonar run all the time. And he was astounded to see that he was mapping all of these features which correspond to continental drift. And so people like Harry Hess were able to confirm what Alfred Wegener had predicted in terms of continental drift. That's a major feature of the Earth. It's very important for the Earth because it enables us to bury carbon through subduction as the plates move around. Then above Harry Hess, you'll see Professor Milankovitch, who was able to explain the ice ages and the interglacial periods based upon orbital dynamics of the Earth, of eccentricity, obliquity, and precession of the equinoxes and how they interact. Above Professor Milankovitch, we have Tyrannosaurus rex. I like to use the dinosaurs as an example of a very long run, 150, 160 million years of fairly stable climate on the Earth, where these animals reigned before the Cretaceous came to an end with the KT impact. Then below Carl Sagan, we have Dave Keeling, who started the iconic measurements of carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa as a postdoctoral fellow with Roger Revelle in 1958. And from Dave Keeling, we know that about half of our total emissions of carbon dioxide accumulate in the atmosphere and how this varies at the Mauna Loa Observatory. Dave Keeling told me once that when he started making these measurements, after the first few months, he thought he had an instrumentation problem because they were changing. It was only after a period of time when he realized he was measuring changes in photosynthesis on Earth. And then his curve became very, very interesting, and it has continued today. On the right-hand upper side of this is a picture of Sputnik, because we're able to use satellites to study the Earth and get repeated measurements of the oceans, the atmosphere, the land, day after day, week after week, year after year. And those data have enabled the study of the oceans, land, and the atmosphere through time. And also, they enable us to understand the interactions among these Earth system components. So therefore, dinosaurs, plate tectonics, Milankovitch cycles, satellites, magnetic fields, and climate, they're all interrelated. And let's go to the next slide, where I will review several of Carl Sagan's Earth and space science contributions, and they are major. He was an advisor to NASA from the 1950s to 1996, the year when he passed on. He was involved in 10 planetary missions as part of the science team on those planetary missions. He was the first to identify on Venus the high temperatures. He postulated they were due to a runaway greenhouse effect because of high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. He inspired interest in extraterrestrial intelligence. He jump-started and popularized exobiology. He was a science communicator extraordinaire. He also was among the first to propose the consequences of a nuclear exchange of the resulting winter, very similar to what happened after the KT impact. And this was a major contribution to understanding more about global warming and the atmosphere and the interaction of different components of the Earth system. I think one of his major contributions was that from his description of the pale blue dot, this has led people to be conservative, and it motivates many of us to help preserve the Earth's biota and to continue the habitability of the Earth, to stop global warming, to deal with all the things we have to. And last but not least, Carl Sagan insisted and was the prime mover, the principal determinant in having a plaque on Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11, which were launched in 1972 and 1973, respectively. And Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 have now left our solar system, and they contain a plaque. So it's sometime in the distant future, if other intelligent life finds these space probes, they'll have an idea where they came from and what the people who built the space probe look like, and several other features. Not to be outdone by the plaque on Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11, Carl Sagan was also the prime mover to get on Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 a more involved compendium of information about the Earth incorporated into a digital recording. And so as Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 have now left our solar system, they are also carrying important information should they ever encounter intelligent life in the distant future. These are all major contributions which Carl Sagan, first person singular, made. So let's talk about the atmosphere and the value of the Earth's magnetic field to the Earth. The Earth has a very strong magnetic field, and this is great because it deflects the solar wind. Now, why is that important? Well, we know from the Maverin mission to Mars that the solar wind strips away the lighter elements in the Martian atmosphere. That's because Mars does not have a strong magnetic field. People ask about Venus. Venus doesn't have a magnetic field either, but the interaction of the strong magnetic field with the ionosphere of Venus magnetizes the ionosphere, and that acts as a magnetic field. Mars is a good example that if the Earth didn't have a strong magnetic field, we would probably be inhabitable just like Mars is at the present time. Speaking of temperatures, there's been a lot of interest in surface temperature reconstructions. Unfortunately, we can't extend these back beyond the latter part of the 19th century to 1860, 1880, because we don't have enough data to construct reliable surface temperature reconstructions from geographically. But since that time, we've had increasingly more accurate and distributed measurements throughout the Earth. And there used to be, the climate change deniers would say, well, we disagree, the Earth, what people are saying about the surface temperature reconstructions are in error. So-and-so says this, someone else says that, we can't decide, therefore we shouldn't do anything. Now there has been a consensus reached. This is not surprising because they use the same input data. They have different interpolation schemes. They have different reference years. But now, from the Hadley Climate Research Unit to the NASA GIST, to NOAA, to the European Center for Medium Range Forecasts, and even to the Berkeley Earth Surface Temperature Reconstruction Group, there is now excellent concurrence that yes, surface temperature is increasing. This is what the trend looks. This is what the trends look like. There is no longer uncertainty over this, and the climate change deniers have had to deal with other issues or non-issues. So let's try and extend this back further to the Cretaceous Earth. So this goes back to the Cretaceous period about 110 million years ago. At that time, the atmospheric CO2 concentration was about 1,000 parts per million. Again, as we go back in time and are interested in the atmospheric CO2 concentration or the surface temperature, we have to use proxies for these. And there is a degree of uncertainty because the further back you go, the more uncertainty that there is associated with the proxies. In the Cretaceous, we know 110 million years ago, there was no ice anywhere on the planet. Sea level was therefore about 100 meters higher, and the average surface temperature at that time was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit versus an average surface temperature on the Earth today of about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The figure below on the lower right hand is the present day equivalent. We're now just above 410 parts per million carbon dioxide. We have glacier sea ice sheets, and we have our present sea level, and the average surface temperature is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a strong linkage between the persistence of surface temperature and sea level through the melting of ice. Let's look also in the Cretaceous and see where exactly the continents were. 110 million years ago, Pangaea was just breaking up. And you see in the upper left-hand corner a reconstruction of where all the continents were 110 million years ago. Of course, we know where all the continents are today. We see that in the lower right-hand image. Now, I've been talking about atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is a figure which gives credit to Dave Keeling, but also to Professor Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist and physicist, who at the turn of the century proposed that the buildup of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would result in warming the planet. Here's the Dave Keeling curve. We see that last month, in July of 2020, the average carbon dioxide concentration at Mauna Loa in Hawaii was just over 414 parts per million. The average carbon dioxide concentration a year earlier, in July of 2019, was about just under 3 parts per million lower. When you look at this curve, the increase is due to our use of fossil fuels, and that's because we see there's an increase from our use of fossil fuels and from land use and land surface changes, but principally deforestation and the conversion of plant carbon into atmospheric carbon, either from burning or from decomposition. We also, when we look at the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, we see that it is modulated, and that is because we see photosynthesis in the northern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere growing season, this pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and incorporates it into plants, into plant material via photosynthesis. And then in the winter, that process is no longer operating because of colder temperatures in the northern hemisphere. and we see the carbon dioxide concentration increasing as more emissions to the atmosphere occur. Now we know at the moment only about half of the total carbon emissions accumulate in the atmosphere. About a quarter go into the oceans and about a quarter go into land. So this is why with satellite data, it's very important if you study global photosynthesis, you have to study the oceans and you have to study the land and study them at the same time and study them through time. Now, this is an image which Gene Feldman produced. I assisted with the land portion of it at the Goddard Space Flight Center. It's the global biosphere from CWIFS data from the same instrument. It shows the chlorophyll concentration in the oceans. The blue colors are areas in the oceans where you have no, or where you have very low concentrations of chlorophyll. These are the biological deserts in the ocean. These are places you wouldn't want to be in the 16th or 17th or 19th century on a sailing vessel because you would most likely be becalmed, you don't have strong winds, and it might take you quite a while to get out of those areas. If you look in the oceans towards the Arctic and towards the Antarctic and along the coast, you see colors that reflect from the red into the green colors. Those are areas that are very productive in terms of photosynthesis in the oceans. On land, you see that the forested areas of the planet, the Northern Hemisphere forest, the Amazon basin, Central America, Central Africa, the Eurasian northern forests, and tropical Eurasia. These are all areas where you have a lot of photosynthesis and have a lot of biological activity there. And in this image, those areas are indicated as the dark green colors. So with satellites, we can study the oceans, we can study land, and with the combination of satellite data, we can study them both, which you have to do if you want to study the global carbon cycle. Speaking of carbon dioxide reconstructions, this is a figure from Bierling and Royer, 2011, where they have used a variety of proxies from stomata, plankton in sediments, paleosols, liverworts, and other chemical techniques to extend carbon dioxide concentration measurements back 65 million years when the Cretaceous ended. So anytime you use proxies and go way back in time, there's going to be an added uncertainty, but this is the best reconstruction of what the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration looked like with all the data on the graph, going back 65 million years ago to the end of the Cretaceous. Now let's look at how the temperature data look for the same time period, going back to 65 million years ago. This is from Zakos et al., 2001. It is based on isotopic differences between oxygen 16 and oxygen 18. And you see the temperature reconstruction. You see that it was much warmer at the end of the Cretaceous as we move into the present time period from 65 million years ago to now, as we enter the Paleocene, Eocene, etc. And you'll notice that coinciding with the collision of India with Asia, we had a gradual decrease in the surface temperature as you move down. People used to hypothesize that carbonate weathering associated with the collision, with the uplifting of the Himalayas might be involved. Now there's been some questions about that. But there's no question this coincides. It could be a coincidence or it could be part of the mechanism of India colliding with Asia and this gradual decrease in surface temperature down to the present time. It's interesting that the Antarctic ice sheet started forming when the atmospheric CO2 concentration reached 450 parts per million. And the Greenland ice sheet started forming when the atmospheric CO2 concentration reached approximately 400 parts per million. Now, as we increase the atmospheric CO2 concentration, we are in danger of accelerated melting of the ice sheets on Greenland first and then Antarctica. So this is something we have to be concerned about in terms of global warming and our stewardship of the planet. When I use satellite data to look at climate, I use this figure, which is a summary. The Earth is warming, and we know this from looking at sea level, the sun, ocean, surface, and atmospheric temperatures, and also the cryosphere in terms of the ice sheets, glaciers, and Arctic sea ice. Now, the best metric if the planet is warming or cooling is sea level, because we can measure that very accurately. We can measure this globally, and that is unambiguous. Associated with that, it's necessary to measure the sun. Many people say, yes, the planet is warming and it's due to the sun. But we've had instruments above the Earth's atmosphere since the late 1970s, and they show us that is not the case. So looking at the total solar radiance from 1978 to the present from a variety of different satellites that have all been reconciled, you have to be above the Earth's atmosphere to study total solar irradiance. And satellites above the Earth's atmosphere are the perfect way to do this. What we see in terms of total solar irradiance is there is an 11-year cycle, which has 1 part in 500 variation. That delta T of 1 part in 500 contributes only 1/10 of a degree centigrade to the surface temperature variation. And this is associated with the 11-year solar cycle. So now these measurements have been extended through the present, and they show the same thing, that the Earth has a very benign sun. There have not been marked variations above 1 part in 500 in total solar irradiance since we started making these measurements of the sun in the late 1970s. Therefore, if the planet is warming, it's not the sun. Now let's look at sea level rise. Now these are measurements made from satellites which have radar altimeters. And we know radars are very good for catching speeders. They're also very good for measuring the height of the ocean through time. And we've had data since 1992 from a series of radar altimeters where we have excellent data of sea level. This is how the data look. These data run from January of 1993 to May of 2020, just a few months ago. And this is what we see. We see an increase on the order of 3.5 millimeters per year. And that is comprised equally of glacial melt from the ice sheets, and 50% of it comes from the expansion of oceans as the oceans warm. Associated with increasing temperatures in water is an expansion. That's called thermal expansion. So sea level is a combination of these two components. How do we know how to differentiate them? Well, we can study thermal expansion. I'll show you how we do that. And we can also measure a glacial melt using satellite observations of the cryosphere and of gravity fields. There's a really cool satellite. It was an experimental mission called the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. 2 satellites which orbit the Earth at 500-kilometer altitude. They're separated by 220 kilometers, and they have a radar which measures their distance or their separation to an accuracy of 0.001 millimeters. And so as these 2 satellites orbit the Earth, what they read out is the separation. And from this, and using Newton's gravitational formula, which appears on the lower right-hand portion of this slide, you can calculate what the mass variation is, how the mass has varied from previous observations. So from these data, we're able to look directly at mass losses. So the GRACE missions, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, has been very, very successful. It measures mass directly. These are how the data look for Greenland. Now, these measure data at an area of about 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers, which is approximately the same size as their separation. And what we see in Greenland is a mass loss. It's represented on the left in terms of colors over this time period. We see an accumulation of mass in the center of Greenland, and we see a loss of mass at the lower elevations in Greenland. And in the center portion of this figure, we see the mass variation from the gravity recovery and climate observations. We see an increase in the winter of mass. We see a loss in the summer, and then we see this downward trajectory from May of 2002 through August of 2016. This is now continuing. So we have excellent data of the ice sheets of Antarctica, of Greenland, and how the masses there have varied over this time period. And then we can use that data to estimate how much water has gone into the oceans. This is how we determine what the component from glacial melt is in terms of sea level rise. Now, what about the thermal expansion of water? Well, there we cannot use satellites. We have to use a large number of floats called Argo, named after Jason and the Argonauts, after the Trojan War, who went around the Mediterranean. And the Argo floats are autonomous floats that float. They're dropped off of ships. They're instrumented. And what the floats do is they're put in the water for a while, checked out. Then they are set in action. They then descend to a depth of about 1,000 meters, where they drift for 10 days. All the time they're recording temperature and salinity periodically, again. Then they descend to a depth of 2,000 meters, again with the same sampling frequency of temperature and salinity. When they reach 2,000 meters, they then begin a slow ascent to the surface, all the time measuring temperature and salinity. When they reach the surface, they have a burst transmission to a geostationary satellite, and then the data are then downlinked to California, where they're all processed. Now, on the 26th of August, the lower figure in the lower right-hand corner shows you the last known position of 3,861 Argo floats that were operating on the 26th of August. So this is how we get the data for the increase in temperature in the oceans, which then can be converted into thermal expansion. And then we reconcile the data we have from radar altimeters for sea level rise to what we get independently from the satellites, from the GRACE satellites in terms of mass loss, as well as the thermal expansion. And those data, the combination of those two data, agrees very, very well with the radar altimetry data. Okay, so I'm nearing the end of my talk, and so I would like to emphasize that from the Hubble Space Telescope, a phenomenal space science instrument, we know there are somewhere more than 1 trillion galaxies, but we only know of one planet that has life. And the Hubble imagery are very, very humbling. And we see everywhere we look in deep space, we see galaxies, and more galaxies. But we know from Carl Sagan that the pale blue dot looks like this. I'm going to play now a recording.
Might not seem of any particular interest.
Of Carl Sagan.
But for us, it's different. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. That's us. On it, everyone you love, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering. Thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization. Every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on the mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam.
Thank you very much for taking part in this seminar. I've been very inspired by the work of Carl Sagan, and I've tried to convey some of that to you through his close association with NASA and space science and earth science. He was a visionary, an excellent scientist, tremendous communicator, and he also, as I pointed out, will probably be remembered many, many light years in the future when other intelligent life finds the plaque or the recordings on the 4 satellites which have now left our Earth system. So I'll now pass you back to Dennis Ojima. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, drop me an email. If I don't respond, send it again and I'll respond the second time.
Jim, thank you very much. That was very inspiring. I don't know if you could turn your video camera on. There was a lot of requests to actually be able to see you.
Well, I've tried, but I have to go into my system preferences and I don't know my system administrator's password.
That's fine. So for those participating, if you want to ask a question to Compton, you could use the question feature. I should have mentioned that before. That's available on the webinar tool set. A question for, sort of to start things off, Jim. What do you think Carl Sagan would view as the big accomplishments in way of looking at NASA's ability to unravel the Earth system and looking at the life dynamic, the biosphere that we are able to do now? I think you're muted, Jim.
I think Carl Sagan would be very pleased that he's motivated so many people to use satellite data to study the Earth. And I think this has led to an unprecedented ability to determine what we're doing, where we're doing it, and what we need to do to continue the habitability of the Earth. Sometimes people, and I think Carl Sagan set in motion many things. He would probably be very pleasantly surprised at the cool things people are doing. I feel the same way when I see what graduate students and young professionals are doing using satellite data, things that all of us who were doing this 20, 30, 40 years ago never would have dreamed of. It's called knowledge. It's called the scientific approach. And I think Carl Sagan would be extremely pleased.
And, you know, looking at the various directorates and groups, programs at NASA, what sort of carryover are there between some of the extraplanetary missions and technology developments and what we use for Earth analysis and vice versa?
Well, when I started at NASA, I got into an argument with some space scientists, and they said, "Oh, you Earth scientists aren't proper scientists." And I said, "Well, why is that?" And they said, "Well, because we in Earth science have to use first principles to study things." And my comment was to him, "Well, you don't have any choice. You can't go and visit what you're studying. Now, one of the problems we have as Earth scientists is we can go out and see the complexity. We can fly in airplanes and study the complexity of the atmosphere. And so I think we have to deal with a lot more complexity. And in doing so, we are getting better and better physical descriptions of the Earth system, whether it's the atmosphere, the land, and the oceans. And this is moving Earth science along rapidly."
And then I have a question from a participant about what do you think about climate engineering as the next step?
Well, climate engineering or geoengineering, if it's only putting up a reflective aerosol level and we continue to emit the same concentration of carbon dioxide, we will acidify the oceans and we will cause a reduction in oceanic photosynthesis from ocean acidification. So that would also not be good. That would be negative. And I think the only solution is to get more efficient in our energy use, to minimize our use of fossil fuels. Fortunately, right now, wind and solar are very competitive, even with the low price of energy today. And we have to stress carbon capture and sequestration. I don't see any solution to that.
Yep. Agreed. And another question about the ocean measurements that you're talking about in the Argo flotilla that we have. What agency is actually responsible for its deployment and its management?
I'm not actually associated with it, but I think that there is, if you go on the web, I think it's sponsored. My guess it's either sponsored by NOAA or sponsored by the National Science Foundation, but I don't want to offend either by saying it's the other.
Yeah, I think it's a combination, but it's useful to look into that. And then an additional question, which is a kind of a long one. I'll read this to you. I've heard some people use the concept of space exploration as a fallback instead of taking care of Earth itself. Do you view it that way, or what's your view on extraplanetary exploration versus looking at sustainability of the Earth system?
I think it's important to spend some of our resources on space exploration because our species has always done this. I think it's also important to continue our studies of the Earth at the same time, and I think we can do both. And indeed, the European Space Agency is stepping up now to do more and more Earth observation, and I hope that NASA continues to do the same. Earth observation as well as exploration and space science. These are all important, and a balanced portfolio, I think, is the only way to go.
Okay. The last question here is looking at some of the instrumentation, and there was one call out to look at, sort of advancements in the GRACE type technology of looking at the geomagnetic fields and things. But it seems to me that there's also advancements in things like fluorescence in our ability to monitor the biosphere and its metabolism. And a third area of interest is in the geostationary aspects we're getting at Earth metabolism is really close at hand. Could you speak to some of the advancements that you see and where you would invest research efforts in really improving our ability to monitor the planetary pulse?
Well, we have unprecedented opportunities. We're able to make more measurements. The place to make fluorescence measurements is from geostationary orbit because you have dwell time. And so to measure chlorophyll fluorescence, you have to operate in regions of the spectrum where there's no downwelling solar flux. And so you have to work within Fraunhofer lines. And so you don't have a lot of bandwidth. And consequently, you have coarse spatial resolution. So I think a combination of spectral techniques always works better than one or the other. I think that there are some new developments to get higher spatial resolution gravity data. That's very important. So there's several new techniques which we can bring on, but the important thing is to continue our time series work on the planet. And at the moment, from the MODIS instruments, we've made unprecedented progress the past 20 years. And now that's being moved down to the 30-meter level with a combination of Sentinel-2 data and Landsat-8 and hopefully Landsat-9 data, along with Sentinel-2A and 2B, where we can now move time series studies down to the 30-meter spatial resolution. When you have time series data, this enables food security, all sorts of uses, as well as planetary monitoring. We now have a lot of commercial satellite data from Planet, from Digital Globe, from other private companies that complements NASA resources. But I think at the end of the day, we need to make sure that these resources are in the public domain so that hedge funds can't take them over and use them to make money. So I think there will always be a public role, but at the moment, private companies are doing some really great things. And I think we just need to work towards some public-private partnership arrangements.
Well, thanks, Jim. Again, we'll have an opportunity to explore in more depth the advancements in remote sensing on September 10th. So our next scheduled discussion with you and Steve Running will be on September 10th, followed by a conversation with Inez Fung and Scott Denny on the carbon cycle, October 1st, and October 22nd. We'll look at issues related to biodiversity, planetary sustainability that Matt Hansen will be involved with. And our last conversation will be with Michelle Betzel, looking at global environmental policies and governance on November 12th. So we'll get these sent out. AGU will be announcing these as these come up. But thank you everyone for being part of the kickoff for the Sagan lecture series, discussion series, and we'll try to get Jim's video to work next time.
Yes, next time I'll have it working for sure, and I apologize for that.
All right, thank you much. Bye.